So now to point 4, and point 4 is probably one of the most important, which is to revisit the fundamentals. So just to remind you, the building blocks that we work with on the physical side of things are footwork, looking, body position, entry, section and exit, speed control and energy management. Point 5, we're going to think about visualization. It's important to not just think what you know what you're doing, but to see it sometimes. It helps to watch pro riders, watching the videos, watching the races, looking not just at the whole, but really looking closely at what they're doing. So rewind, watch it again, watch what their feet are doing, watch what they're doing with their body position, watch where they're looking and how they progress through a section, how they use the trail, etc, etc. We can then film ourselves, have a little look at what we're doing and pick out those elements, see which bits we're doing right. Just one little thing about watching pros and videos, some of those videos are built for cinematic greatness, a little bit of drift and dirt flying up because you're letting the bike drift into a corner might not actually be best practice, just good cinematography. So maybe watching the races when those boys are actually on it and the girls are actually on it performing to the highest level are the ones to really watch. Watching people make mistakes, where did it go wrong, can be really helpful. Once you've got a clear idea of what you should look like through a technique, it gives you something, some framework and some reference when you're actually looking back or actually riding into a section. Knowing what you should look like will help you achieve that. Putting it in layman's terms, building flat pack furniture is a lot easier with all the components laid out if you know what you should be building at the end. If you haven't got a picture in your mind of what it should look like, you're not going to know what goes where and why you've been left with 4 bolts. So when it comes to filming yourself and looking at what you're doing, the first thing to remember is to perhaps the first filming you do, the first run through is to film what you're doing normally. Don't try and gun it as fast as possible, don't try and over egg anything, just see what you do on a normal riding basis. Give yourself a good long run in so you're in the zone, in your riding zone before you get there. Performance anxiety once the camera's on can really kick in, so try and be as relaxed and just do things as you would. We'll then take a look at it, break it down, pick out some elements to polish, point them out to Josh, there shouldn't be too many, and then put them back, practice certain elements before putting it back into the corner, and then we can start adding speed. So Josh and I can now review the little video we've shot. We can just pan through and look at certain elements of that video and then pick out certain elements to work on. There's no point in trying to fix every problem with the next run. So what we can do is focus on a particular problem, perhaps the most obvious one, which Josh has already told me he made. Knowing that he did it before he's seen it is a good sign that he's on the right road. But let's just see it in action, point it out to him, and away he goes to practice perhaps that element alone coming through the corner, or focus on that element alone coming through the corner. The bigger the screen we've got, obviously the more detail we can see. For the purposes of today, we're just using a little smartphone. But what was pretty obvious from the replay was that Josh's head dropped into the corner. He didn't get his head up and look through the corner early enough. 9 feet is by no means far enough ahead to look when you're riding a bike. You want to look as far ahead as you can through sections to get going on what's next. So this time Josh is going to focus on lifting his head up. The other elements are important, but they're not the ones we're polishing. So for now, let's see how much difference he can get with his head up and see how that affects his performance. One thing to remember when you're reviewing filming, and actually becomes very apparent when you watch yourself ride, is that poor outcomes are symptoms, they're not causes. So quite often if you don't see what you're doing, you know you've done something wrong. Oh, I shot wide on that corner, or oh, the nose dipped at the end of that jump, landed a bit heavy, landed a bit too much from the back wheel, front wheel slid out, whatever it might be. They're symptoms, they're not the causes. They're not necessarily the route to fixing them, but looking at what's caused them is. With Josh, we're really fine-tuning stuff. You know, he gets through the corner pretty rapid, but what I'm concerned about is how his ability to then judge the next piece of trail and to keep ahead of the bike and therefore ride ever faster. So to paraphrase that and keep it simple, as I always like to do, don't view the outcomes as the problems. They're just symptoms of an earlier problem, which is the cause that needs mending. Breaking things down in this way is point 7, chunking. The way to learn things and improve things is not to try and improve the whole in one go, but to develop an understanding of the elements and the components that make it up. Chunk it up. It's not my idea, it's an established idea and used in sports coaching at all levels by great coaches across many different disciplines. As well as chunking, we need to think about whether something is a hard skill or a soft skill. There's much more about that in the written word than we're going to cover out here, freezing on the trail, but check it out in the written word and you'll find out a bit more about that too. So alluded to earlier on is point 8, practicing the right way. Just repeatedly hitting the same piece of trail at the same speed, making the same mistakes will not make you any better. You may feel more comfortable with the trail itself and you may end up going a little bit faster. Chances are you're not going to improve your technique. Here Josh is going to come through pretty damn slow actually, but what he's really feeling for is exactly the right position of where he wants to be, how it feels when he performs certain elements of the technique. Now he knows what he's looking for because he's done it a lot before, but he's going to be leaning the bike over in this instance. He's going to be working on twisting his hips through the corner, rolling his weight onto the inside of his foot to get those hips over, keeping his head up and various other elements. But what he's going to be doing is doing it slow enough to correct as he does it. Do that a few times, correcting mistakes as you go, and your practice is going to be much more effective than just repeatedly doing the same thing at the same speed. It gets a little bit boring doing it slowly, so he tends to speed up, but don't worry about that. The important thing is how you practice, and again I'll refer back to the talent code. If you haven't read it and you want to know more about the learning, how we learn, how we develop skills, it will change the way you ride. Part of that process is also making mistakes, not just doing it right every time. Repeatedly doing something correctly will not necessarily improve your performance. Making mistakes and correcting mistakes, understanding why the mistakes were made and then going back and doing it again, you'll learn much faster, you'll develop your brain much more quickly and in the right way, and your skills will develop much more strongly. As well as slowing things down, as Josh just did, to engage in some deep practice and to really feel things, there is a time at which we need to reach, we need to stretch out, we need to push ourselves, and we need to leave our comfort zone. To really get better, we need to know where our limits lie. If you never push those limits, you never come off your bike, you never mess anything up, how are you going to know where your limits lie? So reaching, again, a really important part of learning and developing your skills. That doesn't mean that if you don't crash regularly, you're not trying hard enough. If you crash regularly, you're doing something wrong. But there are times when you are going to go beyond your skill level and things are going to get a bit out of shape. That doesn't necessarily mean crashing, it just means that things might not go as well as they might have done. You might overrun a corner, overjump a jump, land a little bit short, or whatever it might be. Both flight and fight instincts have some common ground. And that's the freeze, very aptly, where you just cease to do anything, you just stop. That could be dead sailoring in the air as you barrel forwards, it could be looking at a tree and heading straight towards it with nothing in your mind about what to do to avoid it, just the impending doom that's approaching. That freeze is something we need to avoid, so in reaching the sweet spot we don't want to overextend into the panic station. But that sweet spot is where a lot of learning is done. In physical terms, finding that sweet spot may not just be about speed, it might be about pushing yourself in terms of the conditions you're riding, the gradient. I've got very used to riding loamy trails with lots of roots. Drop me in a zone where it's just rocks everywhere and it changes my mindset a bit. So that kind of stretches me from that perspective. A lot of guys who ride big mountain terrain where it's all rocks, get to the wooded sections where it's rooty and off camber, and they reach that zone as well. So vary up where you're riding, change your learning environment, change the classroom really, and experience the difference and enjoy the difference and embrace the difference. The more conditions you ride in, be it the weather conditions, the trail conditions or the trail surface, the more you're going to develop.